as the 8th Army was sweeping through North Korea in early October 1950. The Marines' 1st Division was at sea, waiting patiently for the minefield surrounding Wonsan to be cleared. Each day, they watched as outdated sweepers from several UN nations struggled to carve a path large enough for the Marine transports to pass through. Finally, on October 26, 1950, their wait was over. When compared with other amphibious landings in Marine history, Wonsan was relatively uneventful, as Republic of Korea soldiers had passed through the city, clearing it of most enemy threats. The road back would not be so easy. On October 24th, General Douglas MacArthur had lifted all restrictions imposed on his men in North Korea and ordered them to pursue communist forces to the Yalu River. 10th Corps Commander General Edward Almond ordered the 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Oliver Smith, to head north immediately. Their objective, the Chosin Reservoir. Known by Koreans as Changjin, the Chosin Reservoir was home to an important hydroelectric facility. Located 78 miles north of the Korean port city of Hungnam, traveling to Chosin presented several difficulties. Reaching the southern tip of Chosin meant traveling along a one-lane gravel road from Hungnam through the Taebaek mountain range, the treacherous Funchulin Pass, and several Korean villages. While General Smith had no doubt that his Marines could make the journey, he worried that enemy forces would take advantage of road-bound artillery, tanks, and supply trucks traveling along the route. Making matters worse, temperatures were plunging as Siberia's winter winds passed over North Korea.
I was just miserable trying to stay warm. I knew you couldn't really. Of course, tanks then, there was no heater in them. If the engine was running, if you could, you'd get out on the rear deck and warm up a little bit. That's one time the infantry liked to ride those tanks then, during the winter.
The U.S. military entered the Korean War with largely the same uniforms and equipment, subject to minor modifications, as those used in World War II. On October 8, 1950, the day after the U.S.'s northward crossing of the 38th parallel border into North Korea, Mao Zedong ordered the People's Liberation Army's Northeast Frontier Force to be reorganized into the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. Even after Marines began to encounter and engage small units of Chinese regulars, MacArthur and Almond failed to recognize the new threat. Instead, they ordered UN forces on both coasts to advance on the Yalu River in a general pursuit of escaping North Koreans. While General Walker's 8th Infantry dashed through North Korea, stretching their supply lines as they went, General Smith's Marines took a more cautious approach.
And the Marine Division was concerned about it and was actually dragging his feet a little. And to kind of maintain a little more organization so that he could get into the defensive posture if he needed to.
After leaving Wonsan, Smith's Marines traveled north to Hungnam, where British reinforcements awaited them. As the Marines continued to march north through a treacherous terrain in sub-zero temperatures, Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River in force, officially entering the Korean War.
We moved up and were attached to the 8th, which was pretty much our habitual assignment. The 8th was sent up to relieve a Korean division that had lost something like, I guess, about 5,000 meters of ground. They'd been pushed back. 25 one night and 15 the next night, or something like that. Along about 4:30, I guess, in the afternoon, evening. We got some rocket fire, and we'd never had rockets fired at us before. And we had heard a couple of rumors, so we figured, okay, Chinese are here, we probably got some new playmates. And we had heard that they had taken a couple of Chinese prisoners. Well, they popped in a few more rockets, and then we started getting a fairly heavy frontal attack. Or beating them back. We had an extra machine gun on every tank, you know, it was a tripod welder right in front of the tank, about all you do was stick your hand up. So we actually had 330 calibers and 150 on each tank. We were holding them off pretty easily, and the infantry had no problem. We could carry a lot of ammo for them, so they could shoot all they wanted. But all the time they're hitting us in the front, they're pouring around our flanks. And finally they said, okay, you got to move out now. And try to get back below town. I believe it was the Chun-Chan River or something like that. There was a crossing there. But we had a couple tanks that outposted that crossing to hold it. We got back through that, and then it was, you know, back down south again as the Chinese came in. We kind of referred to that as a butt-kicking party, and we were the guest of honor. And we had, the company had 15 tanks committed that night and lost 13 of them.
Some of General Smith's men were resting at their regimental camp when they first heard the news.
Given day, we found out about China being in the war, and we had orders to, within 30 minutes, to head north. Our 1st Marine Regiment headed north without my company. My company, G31, was chosen to stay behind, and we were told the reason we stayed behind was to clean up the regimental camp.
General Smith ordered his men to proceed north quickly to support Army units being overrun by the Chinese Communists, but the winter winds, mixed with an already treacherous terrain, slowed the advance considerably. MacArthur had promised to bring the boys home for Christmas, and no troops were more anxious to get home than the 1st Marine Division. On November 17, 1950, the 7th Marine Regiment reached Hagaru-ri, located on the lower end of the Chosin Reservoir, and waited for Smith to bring up the rest of the division. On November 25th, the Marines received reports that 8th Infantry had been defeated by Chinese People's Liberation Army units and were being driven back towards the 38th parallel. The UN victory, which had seemed so close, was now in jeopardy. As General Smith slowed the Marines' advance to contemplate his next move, 120,000 Chinese soldiers waited in the Taebaek Mountains. General Smith pushed the division hard to get his men to the Yalu River. During a blizzard on November 27th, 2 Marine regiments moved up to Udam-ni. From there, the Marines had hoped to travel cross-country and join up with General Walker's advancing 8th Infantry, dealing a fatal blow to remaining North Korean forces and cutting off the advancing Chinese. The link-up would not take place. That night, with temperatures registering -20 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind howling, elements from 3 Chinese divisions struck the Marine vanguard at Udam-ni.
The first time we ran into this, it was, now if you heard the story about Korea, about the bugles, they literally had the bugle. And and I hear a thing at the ball game, kind of a charge, whatever they do, you know, bugle charge, whatever. And when they come in droves. They come in droves, and as quick as they come, what's left, they leave the same way. They'll hit your line and keep coming, and you shoot until you just can't shoot anymore, and then either they retreat for lack of personnel, or they just get tired and pull back. Now you got to regroup, re-ammo, and start all over again. But I think what they did is that, are you familiar with the Civil War, how they fought? Okay, they just go in numbers, and until sooner or later, the last man gonna come through, and that's kind of the way they did.
For 2 days, Marines held their position against 8 Chinese divisions, while in Western Korea, Walker's 8th Army reeled back from the Yalu River in a massive retreat. The Marines managed to turn aside the first few attacks, but were eventually overrun.
We had 40 dead in the ditches, and this was a mixture of Royal Marines, U.S. Marines, and the Army's Baker Company, the 27th or 7th Infantry Division.
By the following morning, PLA forces controlled the high ground surrounding Udam-ni. At dawn, the tired Marines launched a counterattack designed to drive their enemy back. After scaling the hill's steep slopes, the Marines were drawn into heavy hand-to-hand combat against PLA defenders. The battle raged for several hours as Marines managed to wipe out an entire Chinese company and recapture the hill. In completing their objective, the Marines had suffered heavy losses as nearly 200 of their men died in the morning's action. The regimental commanders, Lieutenant Colonel Murray and Colonel Litzenberg, met in the early afternoon to discuss their position. Both men agreed that the costs of advancing further were too great and consolidated their position instead. Ullman panicked and ordered the 1st Marine Division and Army units east of the Chosin Reservoir to fall back to the port of Hungnam on the Sea of Japan. At 4:30 p.m., the Marines received orders from General Smith to head south. All hopes of reaching the Yalu River were now lost. The 7th Infantry Division and the 1st Rock Corps responded to the order with alacrity, but the Marines regrouped at Hagaru because General Smith decided upon a different plan. After driving the 2 Marine regiments out of Udam-ni, General Sung Shin Lun turned his attention southeast to Hagaru-ri. Within a few hours, General Smith's forward command post was in danger as Chinese soldiers surrounded the base. Smith would need reinforcements quickly if there was any hope of repelling the Chinese advance. This relief would come in the form of a task force organized by Chesty Puller. On November 28th, Marine reinforcements arrived at Koto-ri.
We got to Hagaru-ri and spent a night, and it was probably 10 or 11 more miles that we had to go. And right after we got to Hagaru-ri, while the British 41 Company of Royal Marine Commando, they came in the village that night right behind us.
Consisting of both U.S. and English Marines, these fresh troops were assigned to the newly formed Task Force Drysdale. Organized by Chesty Puller, Task Force Drysdale's mission was to provide relief for the Marine base at Hagaru-ri. Getting to Hagaru-ri would not be easy. An entire Chinese division stood in their way.
We stayed overnight because it was dusk, and they said there's about 10,000 Chinese. There's a division of Chinese in this little valley between you and Hagaru where you're trying to get to. It's only 10 miles, but there's a whole division out there going to try to stop you.
The harsh North Korean winter would also prove a daunting adversary.
When we first got into Hagaru-ri, I understood it was 25 below zero. It was very cold. We got up the next morning out from under, in our sleeping bag, out from under 2.5 inches of snow.
In these adverse conditions, the Marines struggled to keep their supplies and equipment in working order.
We had a 10-in-1 ration that my 8-man machine gun squad divided, and it was frozen so much that we had to use a bayonet to separate chunks of pork and beans for a breakfast meal.
With time running out for the Marines at Hagaru-ri, Task Force Drysdale began to move out early on November 29th.
Well, so by the next morning, we had a tank company of 17 Marine tanks leading out the convoy. We had 140 wheel vehicles, what we call thin-scale vehicles, trucks, jeeps, weapons carriers, such as that, wheel vehicles. And then when things got going rough and it was getting toward dark, they got another tank company, Baker Company, from our battalion to bring up the rear. So we had over 900 troops by this time and 170 vehicles in this convoy trying to get from point A to point B 10 miles away. But there's 10,000 Chinese up there from both sides of the road shooting at us.
As Task Force Drysdale moved out, a newsman asked Chesty Puller how he felt about being surrounded by Chinese forces. He responded by saying, "We've been looking for the enemy for several weeks now. We finally found them. We're surrounded. That simplifies our problem of finding these people and killing them."
We was given orders to go to the second hill, and the British commandos go to the first hill, to take those two hills, and then they were going to come through us and take the third hill. We were to go through them and take the fourth hill. But it didn't work that way. There was too many Chinese, and we were stalled on those two first hills most of the day.
The Chinese soldiers waited as Task Force Drysdale headed right for them.
The Chinese were smart enough to let the armored vehicles through, the tanks. They only managed to knock out one. And they let about a third of the wheel vehicles. And that was all of the wheel vehicles from this George Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, George 2-1, got through. And about half of the Marines of my unit. And then they stopped the convoy, knocked the engines right out of a couple of the trucks with heavy machine guns.
With limited options, the commander of the British Commandos radioed General Smith at Hagaru-ri for help.
They had radioed ahead, the British commander had radioed ahead. In fact, the task force we were in was given his name, Task Force Drysdale. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Royal British Marines. And they had radioed ahead that the fire was getting heavy, and the commanding general up at the Division CP says, "You got to get through at all costs. We need help up here. We're surrounded too." So we tried to push through.
Pushing through would prove no simple task. Shortly before nightfall, the forward element of Task Force Drysdale received orders to use their still functioning vehicles to break through the Chinese lines.
And somewhere near 45 minutes or an hour before dark, both companies was pulled off those hills and told to get on a truck. On the convoy had been stalled all day. They couldn't go because we couldn't go on the little road. And they told us to get on a truck and run over anybody that was ahead of us. That it's imperative that we got to Hagaru as quick as we could because we were about to lose that Hagaru.
While some Marines were finally showing signs of progress, others were trapped in a continually worsening situation. Even the freezing temperatures could not stop the successive waves of Chinese soldiers descending upon the Marines.
I fired over 300 rounds of carbine ammunition that night, and because I knew how much I had under the seat of my truck, and I got back to the truck and got it, and I fired it all. And we had them stacked up like cordwood, the Chinese, but they just kept coming, just kept coming.
Knowing that the trapped Marines were half frozen and running low on ammo, the Chinese offered them a chance to surrender.
Our senior officer by that time was a Marine major. And a couple of our people had been captured, and they sent him back up the road to talk to senior man and tell him, "We're coming in before dawn."
As elements of Task Force Drysdale were being led toward a Chinese prison camp, other members finally reached Hagaru-ri.
We got into Hagaru, I believe, probably around midnight or after. And everybody was so disorganized that nobody knew what was really going on. They didn't know what strength we still had. We had lost a lot of people. And we were put into when we run through the barricade that was established there on the road, they put us into a very frozen field during the night.
During their mission, Task Force Drysdale sustained 162 casualties, with an additional 159 wounded in battle. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale was among those Marines who lost their lives during the operation. On November 30th, Major General Almond flew into Hagaru-ri to meet with General Smith. At this meeting, he ordered Smith to gather his troops and then head for the coast. The Marines would have to act quickly if they hoped to escape the Chinese vice. Smith was given permission to destroy all equipment that would slow his movements. While Smith recognized that his men were both outnumbered and surrounded, he refused to leave any equipment or wounded soldiers behind. His Marines would fight their way out of Chosin or die trying. As Smith's men were preparing to leave Hagaru-ri, 2 Marine regiments were struggling to reach the command post. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis led his 800 Marines from Udam-ni to Tatkong Pass. When Chinese forces first attacked on November 27th, a single company of Marines had been sent to consolidate the pass. Now, nearly 5 days later, Davis's battalion was given orders to relieve them. If the Chinese had managed to overwhelm Fox Company, the Marines would be completely cut off from Hagaru-ri. The Marines traveled by daylight to take advantage of air and artillery support. Once inside the pass, they found Fox Company still holding on. Despite being under constant attack for nearly 5 days, Fox Company had managed to hold out. Of Fox Company's original 240 members, only 82 could still walk when Davis arrived on December 2nd. 62 of these Marines would later require amputations because of frostbite. As Davis's men secured the Tatkong Pass, Lieutenant Colonel Robert D. Taplett was leading the main body of Marines from Udam-ni. Even with close air support, Taplett's 3 rifle companies had been decimated during their journey. Of the 437 combat-able men that departed from Udam-ni 3 days before, only 194 remained. After the 2 Marine regiments were reunited on December 3rd, they prepared for the final stretch of their treacherous mission. As the Marines approached General Smith's forward command post later that evening, they paused to form ranks. With their last trace of energy, the Marines marched into Hagaru-ri, singing the Marine hymn. By 2:00 p.m. on December 4th, the last elements of Taplett's rear guard had safely reached their destination. With his remaining forces now fully assembled, Major General Smith prepared to depart from Hagaru-ri. UN helicopters spent an entire day transporting 4,312 wounded and badly frostbitten soldiers to safety. They also brought an additional 537 fresh reinforcements to assist with the planned breakout. After a day's worth of reorganization, Major General Smith's men prepared to move south toward Koto-ri. Before departing, a British correspondent asked the Major General if his men were retreating. Smith's response has since become firmly entrenched in Marine Corps lore. Retreat hell, we're just attacking in another direction.